Welcome to one of the most complex, deep, difficult to penetrate games ever made. No, I'm not talking about the latest Souls game or some other massively complicated piece of modern software engineering. I'm talking about Kirby Air Riders for the Switch 2. Yes, the new game from Sakurai-san is out, and if the multitude of directs that he hosted wasn't already an indication, there's a lot to this game, but way more than you would ever expect, which is why I've teamed up here with my good friend and colleague, Oliver McKenzie, to discuss it.
Yes, John, this game is absolutely massive. It's absolutely crazy, and it's surprisingly pretty good despite the pedigree of its predecessor, I think.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of, so when people think of Kirby Air Ride, myself included, I genuinely think of two things. One, I always joke that there was this meme going around back in the early days of memes that, yeah, the game gets good after you play it for 80 hours, which just seemed preposterous at the time. And second, it's a one-button game where you basically have strange control over Kirby and that you don't accelerate, you only like basically you do the boost action, right?
Mhm.
But it always felt very janky to me. The camera work, the positioning of the characters, nothing about it felt that great. Which is why I was so surprised when I played Kirby Air Riders that it actually fixes all of that stuff, despite on the surface seeming to be a very similar game. And that's key, right? I think that's, before we get into the tech stuff, that's the big thing here, is that this game feels insanely polished. Everything about it. You can see all the love and effort that the team has poured into the presentation, from the menu system, the transitions, to the racing itself.
Mhm.
I think we both agreed that like the key here is that the camera used while racing is so good. It's so dialed in. The default camera, by the way,
Yeah.
that it sucks you in, going around corners, moving through the world at high speed. Just the basic actions, despite as being as simple as it is on at first blush anyway,
Mhm.
it just feels amazing to play. So I think that's the key here, is this is a game that feels good to play. Wouldn't you say, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it does feel good to play. And just to buttress your point there about the cameras, like the cameras feel so good. Like just the way the camera pulls away and the way you out accelerate the camera a little bit when you hit a boost. When you hit a boost string, the FOV dramatically pulls out. And even just like the way the camera transitions perfectly when you hit an on-rails segment, just the kind of perfect amount of camera lag, because in a racing game, you don't want the camera to track perfectly with the player direction or the player position. You want it to lag a little behind the vehicle, and that's something this game really nailed. In a lot of racing games, what you tend to notice is the camera is like the weakest link in less polished racing games. And in this game, it's a very polished experience, and it just feels perfectly calibrated and tuned to the needs of this game. And another area that I think the game really excels in is just having like great looking particle effects, like these really bright flashes of color that have like a blue and orange coating for boosts and attacks. That feels actually very reminiscent of Super Smash Brothers, which is perhaps not much of a surprise given the pedigree of this game's creator, obviously, in his history with that series. And they kind of add to the chaos, but they also emphasize player interactions and make the game, I think, a little bit more visually readable as well. So they actually make the game a little bit more intelligible, which is very helpful because this is an extremely chaotic game, at least in certain modes, like the air ride mode. It can be extremely hectic, I would say. And there's also like a little bit of motion blur, not much, but if you look towards the bottom area of the screen, maybe the bottom fifth of the screen or bottom third, there is some motion blur in that area. But in the area of the screen that your eyes will naturally track and be focused on, there is no motion blur in that area. So it's kind of just enhancing that sense of speed and giving you that sense of motion in your periphery, which you really shouldn't be focusing on directly anyways during the normal course of gameplay.
That's actually an amazing feature, I think. Personally, I love motion blur in racing games. I think it adds a lot to the sense of speed, but it can be overdone.
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely a case where they've applied it in just such a way that it enhances the sense of speed, but it never obscures what you're looking at down the track, which can be a problem in some games. So I'm really impressed with how that has been implemented, because not only does it look good visually, but it also showcases that this engine they're using, something we'll talk about in a moment, is more than capable of these sort of modern per pixel effects. So yeah, the fundamentals, they nail them. That's key. And of course, the whole presentation around it, it's very Smash-like in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
But Oliver, so what do we have in here in terms of overall content? You've played it more than I have, but it seems like there's actually a mix of both like new and old tracks here and some pretty interesting looking visual designs as well.
Yeah, so I've probably put about a dozen hours or so into the game. I'd love to have more more time to invest in this game because there is so much stuff, as we'll discuss later.
80 hours, baby.
80 hours. Yeah, 80 hours. But in this game, there are 18 tracks in the Air Ride mode, which is kind of the standard race event, although it's kind of more of like a race combat game. It's not quite a standard racer, as I'm sure you can see. There are 9 new tracks and 9 returning tracks, plus a lot of other tracks in different modes and different varieties, which we'll maybe talk about in a bit. But I think the new tracks mostly look excellent. My favorite one is Steam Gust Forge, which has so much movement and animation and like steam blowing wildly past, pipe shaking, trains passing through. It looks so cool. And it has a lot of great art too, which I think is enhanced by much better materials than you might expect for a game like this. Like if you look across the road surface here, you see a pretty fine-grained specular response, and the highlights are kind of blurring and sharpening across diffuse and glossy materials, and it just looks really good, right? That high-quality material response. In motion, maybe that isn't as noticeable, but when you get that kind of splash of color or highlight as you're going past, you can really get that sense of physicality and kind of realness to the environment.
Yeah, and that's one of the key differences here versus a lot of other Nintendo titles that we're used to seeing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they actually do have a proper sort of like physically based materials pipeline in effect. And so just the general surface, the surfaces, the objects you see plastered around the environment all have a level of tangibility to it that we're not used to seeing in Nintendo first party titles.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that really sort of gives it this more, I don't want to say it goes this far, but it's like a CGI-ish look to it than some of the other Nintendo titles might have had. Like, whereas Mario Kart World, for instance, feels very much rooted in the Switch, this feels like it's a more forward-looking game and sort of the tech being used.
Yeah, it definitely does. It feels very modern in a way that maybe those other titles don't. Now, in some respects, it's not totally modern, and you can tell this is something that's not like pushing out the absolute limit of visual technologies. Like, for instance, you can spot some low-res art in places. During gameplay, it's not very noticeable, but like if you stop and smell the roses, you can see some low-res textures here and there. Nothing too egregious, but certainly noticeable. And the reflections rely primarily on cube maps and not like SSR or anything more exotic than that. But I actually think at speed in a game like this, that's probably the right call, because like there are some games that use SSR on Switch 2 at the moment. Maybe that call is not quite suited for the hardware, like Fast Fusion, which uses SSR, but it's at a very low resolution, and I feel like it doesn't really read well or look too good in that game at speed, right? So maybe that's a sensible choice.
I agree. SSR is one of those things where you have to use it very delicately.
Yeah.
And also when it's done at a lower precision, you really feel the results. But any game that has a lot of water, for instance, like if using it on a body of water where you have third person sort of like characters moving around the screen, it occludes the scene so much that you just end up with this noisy, ugly result. So I actually think getting nicely aligned cube maps here in a racing game makes a ton of sense and looks great. As we know, Mario Kart World actually had a pretty clever solution for that as well.
They had like a real
It's like the dynamically updating one.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Here, that's not the case, but I'm not sure it needs it because there's not nearly as much like open water. But I do like in the very first track when you go through that cave and you see like sort of the entrance reflecting in the water. It's effective. It looks good, and your brain's not going to see any issues with it, despite just being a cube map.
Yeah, it's aligned to like a sufficient degree of precision that when you're actually driving past, it looks perfect. Now, if you stop and do something that's very unlike what you should be normally be doing in Kirby Air Ride, you can notice some kind of misalignment there. But I think it generally looks quite good. I think in general, basically, the takeaway is that on the new tracks, they all look quite good. They look quite handsome, and they appear at quite a high level of fidelity. But I think there is a bit of a division in this game between the new tracks and the returning tracks. I did go back to the original, and you can see that they're very clearly quite closely lifted from the original game. There is a pretty wide range of upgrades here. You can definitely see that the textures have been improved greatly. The models have been improved, not in a wholesale manner necessarily with respect to like all the model geometry, but certainly a lot of the model geometry has been touched up substantially. Obviously, the courses are using much more modern lighting techniques. You have all kinds of new particle effects, new grasses, vegetation, things like this in the mix. There are definitely some tracks and sections of track, though, where you do really see that heritage quite closely, like in the track Machine Passage that has very, very similar level geometry from the Kirby Air Ride game from 22 years ago. which is not quite so flattering. I would say it looks quite chunky. So I would really treat these as more of like a nice bonus. Like, it's cool they added them to the game, and it's great they doubled the track count by leaning on those older tracks, but they're not nearly up to the same level of quality as the new tracks. And that's not even just technical. That's also like in terms of complexity. That's in terms of concept. Like, the new tracks are built around more interesting ideas and more fully fleshed out concepts than the older tracks, which kind of tended to take you through a location without as much interesting art or kind of eye-catching vistas as you'd see in the newer tracks. So it's really more of a bonus here that you have those old tracks. They're not up to the same level of quality as the new tracks.
And I think that's honestly fair, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I will say, looking at them side by side here, like you take the sort of Lava E track, I forget the name here, but when you compare that, look at Kirby himself. And I think this reveals one of the key enhancements here. It's the lighting.
Right.
Like, Kirby himself has this like smooth glow around him, like a perfect sphere. He's got the sort of the edge lighting right along, the top of his head, and it goes this smooth shaded body that feels very round in a way that when you look at, almost like there's like subsurface scattering happening, which I don't even want to think about that in relation to Kirby's body. It's a very strange concept to me, but it is kind of there. Whereas on GameCube, obviously, they do try to do some rim lighting in spots, but it just obviously lacks that fullness. And lighting, I think, is indeed the big thing that separates this visually from a lot of other recent Nintendo products, specifically the indirect lighting.
Yeah.
And this is a game, so as we always do, when we get a new Switch game, you pop into the intellectual property notices and sort of sift through it. That's where you see information, things like, oh, okay, this game uses SMAA, or, it's Unity-based, just as I thought. That sort of thing. It's always revealed within. People spotted for this game, though, something called RTX-GI from NVIDIA. And there was an initial reaction like, oh my gosh, everything's ray traced here. But in reality, RTX-GI can also be used to do offline rendering. It can essentially bake out lighting. And Oliver, I'm pretty sure that's what we're seeing here based on the results. But that's okay, right?
Yeah, so NVIDIA's RTX-GI here has a number of functionalities. And basically what it seems likely that they're doing here is they're probably using RTX-GI in kind of an offline fashion to bake out perhaps GI probes, possibly to light dynamic objects. So that would be a pretty common use case here. Indeed, the game seems to rely a lot on light maps, I would say. Like, if you stop and smell the roses, again, to use that term, which you probably shouldn't be doing too much, but you can see there are some like very low resolution shadows here and there and some fairly low resolution lighting in the environment. It looks good at speed. I think that's the key thing here. And I think that this game is making a lot of the same calls as we've seen in recent Mario Kart games, which are built obviously under similar constraints, where again, they're really focusing on creating kind of an interesting environment, interesting flashes of color, interesting lighting that is broadly correct, but perhaps not very precise. Because that matters when you're driving past at speed, right? You're not really focusing on the little tiny details. And also, you don't want to see breakup in the image. You don't want to see areas of perhaps GI that might need to be temporally treated that might only look good with like DLSS passes and denoising. Not only is there not the time for those techniques necessarily, the render time that is, also those techniques tend to fall apart in motion, which I think we see with some other games, right?
Precisely. And I think that's one of the key things I want to highlight with this game, is that it's a perfect showcase of why sometimes less is more. You have to pick your techniques carefully when designing a game, which they've clearly done here. Because as you said, if they had gone for like a fully ray traced solution for the lighting, there would be some benefits, of course. It could look cool. But knowing the hardware platform and knowing the speed of the game, it's safe to say that there would be too many sacrifices, both in terms of performance and image quality, right? You wouldn't be able to denoise it quickly enough or without artifacts to actually make it worthwhile using. You would just end up with this sort of like noisy, dithered result with an overall lower resolution and probably worse performance for little gain. And so by baking out lighting into light maps, which, that's tried and true, right? It goes back to the 90s, the idea of this is actually why sometimes 90s games seemed better lit than like the early 360 PS3 era, where they went fully dynamic, because you were basically doing ray trace lighting and then just baking it out into light maps, right? And so you actually, it's like static ray tracing. And that works for a game that is static. Like this game is static. It has animating elements, but there's no real time of day. You're not
Mhm.
really exploring anything. You're just moving through the world very quickly, and it's designed to look a very specific way. So you get many of the benefits of it by just sticking to tried and true light maps. And I think that the results sort of speak for themselves and sort of highlight that they made the right choices. It's the type of stuff I've talked about with something like, say, Ridge Racer 7 at the PS3 launch, doing 1080p 60. They made choices that are perhaps not as cutting edge as other games at the time, but the benefit was higher frame rate, higher image quality, and beautiful art direction. And I think that's precisely what we're seeing with Kirby here. And it makes a difference.
It does, it does. But one interesting element of this game that is like kind of shocking and very surprising is despite, obviously we have a bit of a mix here, right? We have a PBR pipeline, clearly. We have high quality environments, maybe a lower fidelity approach to lighting, but potentially with this RTX GI here.
Right.
And I think maybe what helps explain some of those choices perhaps is they actually are using a new engine based off of what they've talked about, and also some job listings. It's called the Sol Aves engine, or SOL-AVES. I believe it's the Sol Aves engine, although I could be getting the pronunciation a little bit wrong there. And if you look that up, Sol is Latin for sun and Aves is Latin for bird. So it's basically the Sunbird engine, if you will. Anyways, this is an engine that was first mentioned in 2022, and it's described as being an engine that's meant for current generation platforms. And according to job listings, it supports PBR and RT and a number of other very modern rendering technologies as well. It's also designed to support open world games, other kinds of game types, which perhaps comes into play in the city trial mode, which is definitely an open world mode, which we'll discuss shortly. But perhaps its appearance is a little bit less ambitious than some of the games that will ship on this engine in the future, I'm sure. But it seems like Namco Bandai is trying to get away from Unreal, which is primarily the engine they've used, third-party engine they've used for most of their games over the past, 10 years, 5 years, something like that, right, with lots of their titles. But I think overall, it produces a good result. It performs well, it runs well, it looks good. And they've clearly achieved something that's quite visually striking in this game, and quite visually unique as well. There's nothing really else like it on the market at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's I'm very eager to see where this goes, because obviously beyond producing their own games, and Bandai Namco has focused very heavily on Unreal Engine games to this point. This could be a good chance to get away from that, especially in multi-platform scenarios. But obviously Bandai Namco also has a strong relationship with Nintendo, contributing to some of its titles. And I think this is a good opportunity for them to achieve new, better looking results than what we've seen before. Because as I alluded to earlier, and I think, what do you think about this, Oliver? I feel like when the Wii U was established, Nintendo sort of upgraded all their in-house technology to sort of like a certain baseline. And I feel like they've sort of largely stuck to that baseline for the past decade with like similar types of rendering features. Like even in cases where things were a little bit further pushed out, like, Breath of the Wild, for instance, there's still a lot of commonalities in the way that things just look and work. They may not be exactly the same engines, but you can see that there was a lot of similar thinking going on in terms of how the rendering occurred. And you can see here that that's quite different with Kirby Air Riders, which lends the game a pretty cool, unique look. And I'm really happy to see this. And in fact, on the website, they're actually still recruiting people, engineers, for working on this engine. So I'm very curious to see what other ambitions Namco might have in store for this engine going forward.
Yeah, I think we're just starting to begin to see the fruits of Nintendo perhaps pushing in more interesting directions with their engine technology. Obviously in Donkey Kong Bonanza, we saw the introduction of new voxel technology that certainly looked very interesting. I don't know if it has broad applications beyond that particular game, or perhaps an upcoming sequel or something like that, but it certainly was very compelling. You also have like games like Mario Kart World embracing kind of PBR materials, embracing a PBR pipeline, and looking quite good for it. So I think that there are some signs Nintendo's pushing that direction, but for sure, I think Nintendo has been in a bit of a state of stasis, in part. Perhaps that's an internal directive, but also in part, when you look at the Wii U, when you look at the Nintendo Switch, there's not a gigantic difference in capabilities that favors the Switch.
It made
sense. It made sense. But John, I think we've spent enough time talking about the core kind of engine technology here, and in particular talking about that air ride mode, because I think that is kind of like the most perhaps visually eye-catching mode And it's also the most interesting mode just in terms of the kind of content they're displaying to you. It's also kind of the canonical mode, the first mode that's in the menu. But there actually are 3 other modes in this game, which help to give it, I would say, an enormous amount of gameplay variety and content. And perhaps the most significant of those modes, which perhaps you can walk us through here, is the city trial mode. And I don't know how much you've played the city trial mode. It does some really interesting things. It's kind of like this crazy party game, mini game centric multiplayer mode.
Yeah, so I mean, City Trials existed in the original as well, and it's sort of been expanded out here, where you have a bunch of these different gameplay types all sort of jammed together into. The way I would describe it is, so I said this earlier when we first started talking. It's like, to me, this reminds me of WarioWare. Only instead of micro games, you have macro games, games that take. They're not long, but they take significantly more time than anything in WarioWare, where there's always this feeling of just like the gameplay being changed up around you, and you're always being asked to do new things within the sort of like basic control and constraints of the Kirby Air Riders formula, right? And I think that's why this game has been a difficult one to explain to people, because on the face of it, it seems just like a racing game, but it's not. Like
Right.
there's all this combat stuff and collection stuff, and just like all these goals and things to achieve, and so many different vehicles and things to master, and everything kind of controls differently. And there's just this constant stream of new stuff happening in there. And it actually works better this time than at least my memory of the original Kirby Air Ride anyway. And I actually had a lot of fun playing this.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, like, the core idea here is you spend 5 minutes, you have 5 minutes to travel around, like, this really wide open gameplay space and basically collect upgrades along with 15 other players. And then over the course of that kind of 5 minutes, various events might start, like these huge upgrade containing pillars might spring out of the ground, or you might have a big brawl or a race where you need to go to a certain place on the map and then engage in kind of this timed event. Or you could have like a treasure hunt or different kinds of events here, very interesting stuff. And all kinds of modifiers can spring forth. Like there could be like a Silent Hill like fog that descends upon
my favorite is Gordos are falling from the sky.
Gordos. Or you could become gigantic and grow to like 20 times the size.
Yes.
That's another crazy one. And then after 5 minutes, basically, you choose one of 4 challenges that appear, which are kind of these randomized challenges. Like it could be like a race, a brawl, a high jump, and like a food collection race or something like that.
Yeah, the freaking food collection, man.
There's a lot of food collection in this game. It's quite an interesting.
I love how they use those pseudo realistic flat textures as the food items.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit out of place, but you get used to it fairly quickly, I would say.
It's pretty funny that it works.
Yeah. And so I think the basic strategy here is like you go through, you try to find a machine in the environment that is suitable to complete one of these challenges, one of the challenges you might expect might occur, and then to get suitable upgrades such that perhaps you could either become like a very well-rounded racer, or you could choose like try to get a bunch of glide on your racer or something and be really well suited for the high jump, right? There are a variety of different strategies, but I think it's kind of a party game kind of atmosphere. I noted that a lot of reviewers have really glommed onto this mode as being one of their favorites. It definitely is very different from the other modes, which even though they're not like pure racing games necessarily, they do have a strong racing component. This has less of a racing component and more of like a collections component, more of a combat component in some cases, and more of an exploratory component. And then that's all mixed in with these modifiers and all these random events, which completely change the scope and the outcome of the match, which are, I think, quite interesting and really add a certain captivating quality to this mode.
Absolutely. As you noted, though, obviously the City Trials is less focused on racing, even though there's sometimes racing events in there. But I actually think they sort of took the concept of the City Trials and then condensed it down and do it's more of a single player story focused thing with the road trip option. And road trip is like the one completely new mode in this game versus the GameCube game. And I like this because similar to City Trials, you're faced with various events and such, but instead of having this world that you run around collecting items in, you're dropped onto a track, and at the lower corner you actually see like your progression from like the beginning to the boss of each world. And on the track you can move between the 3 lanes, and you're sort of deciding between like power ups, which events you're going to play, the mini games, possible boss encounters, as well as like rest stops and all that. So you're basically traveling along the road, completing events along the way in a linear fashion. But it seems like a random selection of different modes, basically. And there's like cutscenes and stuff to go along with it. Similar to some of those Smash modes we've seen, like the GameCube one, I guess, or not GameCube, like the Wii game, where you had a sort of story to follow.
Right.
Even though it seems insane so far, I'm very curious to see where that goes. But I like this mode because it is the one that actually has what feels like proper progression.
It does.
Like when you just play, say, air ride mode, for instance, it's just like selecting a track and just going, and there's no real progression through it. Like it's not like an arcade racer where it's just like one track to the next. It's just like randomly selecting stuff. And City Trials also feels like a big, blast of mini game goodness. But it's also very party game like.
Right.
This is actually like a proper single player mode. And it gives you a good taste of many of the different types of things in here. You will, of course, find the fruit collection in there. You find drag racing, etc. All that stuff's here, as well as like boss fights and such. So it's a nice mode.
Yeah, it's kind of a meta mode that combines at least elements,
everything.
If not, basically everything else, plus original elements like those boss fights and different kinds of things like that.
Yep.
I would call it it's kind of like a randomized campaign, right? Because
that's a good way to say it.
Because you have this like almost like roguelike structure, although you can retry events if you fail them, or you can go back to a checkpoint if you want to try different events. Like there's no real punishment involved here unless you want to go up to the very highest difficulty, in which case there are no retries. But yeah, there is very clear progression in this mode. I think once you complete it with a character, you get like a little badge indicating that you've completed it with that character on the main screen of the road trip mode. In the other modes, there is a kind of progression, but it's interesting. They don't really give you this like traditional progression, not even kind of like a Grand Prix type progression that you might see in a game like Mario Kart. You basically just play one-off events, and then over time you might get unlockables, which are collected through this kind of collections board, where each mode and also the online mode has 150 collectible little dots on the board, where you can basically get collectibles and unlockables as you complete different challenges in the game. But there's one other mode in this game that perhaps we can just touch on briefly because it's not so significant as the other ones.
And it shows up in the road trip. And
it does, yeah.
It's there. You'll encounter this.
Yeah, it's the top ride mode, which is basically like a little top-down racing event. The mechanics are very similar to the regular racing, the regular air ride mode, but they're from a top-down perspective, and just because of the nature of the track design, there's more turns and drifts, so it feels more like a traditional racer. This is probably the closest thing to a traditional racing game, albeit in the style of like a Micro Machines or something, right?
Reminds me of Pixel Junk Racers.
Yeah.
Or MotorStorm RC.
And
right?
I actually did enjoy this quite a bit. And there are different camera modes here as well. Like you can play with a very zoomed in camera that follows you closely, a medium distance camera that follows you a little bit throughout the screen, but mostly shows like 60% or 70% of the screen at once. And then another mode, which is very useful for multiplayer play, that shows the entire track all at once, right?
Exactly.
So I think this is pretty cool. This mode has 9 tracks, which if you're following along, that's the same number of tracks as there are new tracks in the game. And all the tracks here are basically like condensed little diorama versions of the main new tracks in the game. It's a nice little addition to the game. I suspect this is probably going to be the least played of the 4 modes, if I'd had to guess. But I think it's also the most clear and pure racing type mode. So if you're interested in racing games and you don't mind a little top-down action, this could be for you.
Interestingly, though, this is the one mode where I looked at it and thought, man, it would be cool if this was actually native 4K because of all that small detail, which brings us to our next section where we talk about image quality. Given that we're on a new engine and we're targeting Switch 2, and of course the frame rate target is 60 frames per second, I was certainly curious to see how this would look. And so I've only played docked mode thus far, and just looking at it, it looks like we're basically dealing with what seems to be 1080p.
Right.
But I did not do any pixel counts on this myself. So I'm wondering, Oliver, did you find any variance in that, or did you largely get 1080p with your results?
Yeah, so basically, in terms of the raw pixel counts, every shot that I got back in dock mode was at or very close to 1080p. There were some shots that seemed to come in a little bit north of that, maybe 1152p, but that's the kind of range, like 1080p, 1152p, that kind of area for this game in general, I think, in docked mode. The only real exception would be top ride. I did count a few shots out in top ride mode, and these seem to come a little bit closer to 1440p. They were definitely significantly above 1080p, a little bit closer to that kind of 1440p mark in terms of resolution. But it's also like hard for me to say that's like an absolute judgment here.
Exactly.
This is a really big game and there's so much variance and so many different kinds of rendering scenarios and so many different kinds of menus. All I'll say is that in typical gameplay across the various modes, it does usually appear to be in kind of that 1080p range and somewhat higher in that top red mode as well. That's backed up by SMAA, I suspect, based off of the information, the game's licensing information. There's very clearly post-process AA, and it is very likely SMAA, I would say. Portable mode is more variable, so 900p came up a lot for me. That seems to be typical during races. But I got counts as low as 720p in very intense moments in like city trials and things like that. I also got counts as high as 1080p, so I suspect there is some dynamic res in the picture there, just depending on the kind of rendering scenario, depending on the kind of mode. Again, there's some variance, but I think 900p is about the average. Image quality I think is decent, but I would definitely say that it looks better in the portable mode, at least from my perspective. Even though it is a lower resolution, obviously that's stretched to a smaller display that is nearer in terms of pixel density.
Yeah.
And I think that's more flattering. It's an interesting approach, though, because the game obviously doesn't use DLSS. We've discussed DLSS in some length here, including the light model of DLSS, or the tiny DLSS model, as Alex calls it. And I think that wouldn't be very appropriate for this game just because of its extremely fast speed. The full-fat DLSS model, it would be tough to square that with the kind of rendering demands of a 60 FPS Switch 2 game, especially if you're trying to hit high resolutions. For the most part, that portable mode is a more flattering way to experience this game, but I think they're leaning a little bit more into dynamic resolution to fill up kind of the rendering gap between the two modes, and they're also possibly leaning a little bit more on VRR to absorb any kind of performance knocks that might take place as a result of a generally higher rendering resolution relative to capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. And I kind of walked away with the same impression where the image quality is a bit soft on the TV by today's standards, but it's still an upgrade over where we would likely have seen a Switch 1 game land. So it's good enough in that regard, even though it could be slightly better. And yeah, I don't think the light DLSS would have been suitable for this game.
Yeah.
It would have just been a noisy mess. Of course, though, when you play on the screen, you are limited by the low response time of the screen as usual. But since most of the game moves forward into the screen, it's not as egregious as other games that have a lot of lateral movement.
Yeah.
So it is fairly good on that screen. The only downside, and this applies both to the screen, obviously, and the TV output itself, the HDR implementation is exceptionally bad. So first of all, the game does actually register that you're in HDR in its options menu, and it has white, black, overall, and UI adjustment settings. Although the white and black levels are just set to their max and min respectively out of the gate, and there's really no additional adjustments you can do there. So it does rely on the system level calibration as well. But the main issue is that the only thing that really seems to take advantage of the higher luminance are the particle effects, like those emitted by your ride, I guess. So like you'll see the star is like the sort of like trail blast of light, whatever they leave in their wake. That is quite bright, but everything else around the game looks very washed out and dim in comparison. Now, obviously, depending on your TV, you can deploy things like dynamic tone mapping to sort of bring up the overall scene brightness and create a punchy but flatter kind of image. But you're really not going to get anything good in the way of HDR here. So even on a screen that's excellent at HDR, which of course means that in portable mode, you weren't going to get a good HDR presentation anyway because of the screen, and you most certainly do not. It just looks straight SDR by my estimation. I think you could probably agree with that, Oliver.
I do agree with that. In general, it looks very washed out, I would say, at least on my television set. I can't speak for everyone, but at least with my kind of standard suite of Switch 2 HDR settings, the game did not look very good at all. And then you have those extremely bright highlights, but I don't know, it says something interesting about the exposure of those highlights that even in an extremely bright environment, even in the bright sun, those highlights would be like several times brighter than the
Yeah.
highlight on the sun. So it doesn't really read like a physically plausible kind of approach to
No.
rendering
No.
HDR. It feels much more like an approach to rendering HDR that's, I mean, maybe interesting for gameplay reasons because you are highlighting those impacts, but probably not an approach to HDR that's actually going to produce a pleasing image, at least without some kind of dynamic tone mapping technology, which I kind of feel like at that point, you're kind of just engaging
Yeah.
in like hacky stuff to work around that.
Yeah.
It's not really
Sometimes
not
you got to
ideal.
do that, though.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
And that's the thing is like I feel like it just looks unnatural and like borderline broken.
It
Like the
does.
results of only having those specific elements at that luminance, it doesn't look correct. Like your eyes just see that and you're like, oh, this looks like somebody botched an HDR implementation, which they did.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're in that period now where we can talk about HDR on Nintendo platforms, and unfortunately, they have not been doing that great of a job. But I would still take something like Mario Kart World any day over what they're doing here. So this
Yeah.
might be one game that's best played in SDR actually, because yeah. But of course, the big visual thing that it's focusing on as a pseudo racing game is 60 frames per second. That is the performance target here. There is no 120 hertz support at all.
Yep.
This is just a 60 hertz game. And thus far, I've only had a chance to play it in single player mode, full screen. And in my experience, it largely holds steady. Not perfect, but I feel like the general experience you get is pretty much a stable 60 to the point where I would say it's just fine. But I know, Oliver, you did a little bit more sort of tests on this. And I think when you play in like the city trials, especially, there's definitely some dips here and there. But
Yeah.
what all did you find in terms of the performance results here?
Yeah, basically my outcomes here were very similar to what you described, at least in 3 of the 4 modes, where basically it's like a locked 60 FPS, except maybe in like air ride mode. At the very start of a race, you might like drop a frame, or maybe in the middle of the race, you might drop like 1 frame. It's very insignificant in the grand scheme of things. City Trial is the exception. It seems to drop frames regularly. It's not too bad, but it is noticeable. There's also some things that you can notice in City Trial mode, like you can see some decimated animation at a distance with like NPCs and things like that, presumably to ease CPU demands, which we actually pretty commonly see in Switch 2 software at the moment. I also tried split screen with 2, 3, and 4 players. Now it's actually possible for me to play split screen in this game, even without other people around, because the game basically plays itself.
You're right.
So I was able to just have the very minimum of inputs every so often on the other control interfaces on the other control pads and still actually enjoy the game in 4-player split screen, which is pretty extraordinary. So in races and busy sections, you get a lot of dropped frames. Races, they don't run so well in these modes, especially as you ramp up to like 4 players. But City Trial runs in the 40s and 50s for the most part, it seems like, with multiple players, which is not quite satisfactory. So the game is basically aiming for 60 FPS in all the split-screen modes, which is an approach that's unlike some other split-screen games on Switch 2. Yeah, Mario Kart with 3 and 4 players
right?
is a 30 FPS title. This is actually aiming for 60, which is pretty admirable here. But it's just a little bit too much for the system, unfortunately, in split-screen with this much stuff going on. I also tried the game in handheld mode, and it basically runs at 60 FPS, but I did feel some drops sometimes, especially in City Trial. So I don't have time to test this in detail myself, but I kind of speculate maybe they're leaning on VRR a little bit more in handheld play, along with DRS, to try to absorb some of that performance difference.
But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it for this game. We've talked a long time about it because really, fundamentally, that's kind of what it needs, because it's so weird that this game that looks so simple on the surface always ends up being such a weird, complicated beast. And I can't imagine having developed this because there's so much weird stuff in here that's all interconnected that you're like, how did they even plan this game out? Because it's like a type of game that largely doesn't exist. And for that, I think it's pretty darn cool in the end. And of course, we're also excited to see where this new engine will go and what other titles will use it. I'm especially curious about its use on non-Nintendo hardware.
Absolutely.
What can they do with it on a more powerful platform? It seems like it seems promising, and we're always excited to see new non-Unreal, non-Unity tech enter the space. So it's been a while, but here it is. So that's great stuff. But I think that's going to do it, Oliver, unless you have any closing thoughts here.
I do regrettably have a few closing thoughts in the game.
Regrettably.
That I just wanted to kind of wrap up with, because I have somewhat complicated feelings about the game overall. I mean, not complicated in the sense that I'm like extremely divided on the game, just complicated in the sense that the game itself is extremely complicated, and wrapping my head around it has taken some time, and perhaps I will need that vaunted 80 hours to fully get to grips with the game's mechanics, although I suspect that might not even be enough in some cases. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think visually the game looks great. Obviously, it's fast, performant, excellent art, extremely polished from end to end, with maybe the exception of some of those returning courses, which is totally understandable. As a game, I really do like it, but there are some caveats. Like, I think the one-button nature of the game, the auto-accelerate nature. Technically, it's a two-button game, but obviously that is, it's basically one-button game plus a button to activate your special ability.
It's actually like Balan Wonderworld, for those that remember, where like every button is the one button for the most part, except for, I guess, Y.
Right, like exactly, one of the... Y. Basically, like a bunch of face buttons and all the triggers, you can hit anyone you want to, but they all decelerate you, drift you into corners, attack enemies, and inhale enemies, which actually works better than you would think. But there are some elements that I don't love. Obviously, I think I'd prefer a game with a little bit more of a variety of control surfaces and a little bit more of a variety in terms of the kinds of inputs you can make. But in general, the one area where I take significant issue with that approach is when it comes to spins, because you spin your vehicle by kind of rapidly shaking the left stick from side to side. And I think ergonomically that could be a problem for a lot of people. And it's easy to trigger when you don't want it to. Now, there's some sensitivity settings, but I was never able to find a setting that allowed me to trigger it 100% of the time with enough precision and enough speed to make it feel responsive as a gameplay mechanic, fully responsive as a gameplay mechanic. Wish they would just offer you an option to like hit the X button and do it instead. But yeah, and the game often itself feels a little bit on rails. Perhaps that comes from the auto-accelerate nature of it. Perhaps that comes from the small track design. But in general, it tends to feel a little bit on rails as well. But the overall feel is quite amazing for the game. So I think like the concept of this game as a one-button racer feels like it shouldn't work. But the developers' incredible talents have clearly gone into making a game that does kind of work. And as just one final note here, there's so much of this game that we don't have time to cover, because obviously we've spent like 40 minutes chatting here, but there's a ton of stuff. Like there's 21 racers, 28 vehicles, which all differ wildly from each other. So like, the corner handling of the vehicles is totally different. Some drift normally, some have a kind of aim-based drift boost where you aim into corners. Some don't drift boost at all. One vehicle doesn't decelerate at all. It just stops on a dime, and you have to reorient it whenever you stop the vehicle to move the vehicle in a different direction. There's one vehicle that can transform between different modes. There are vehicles that can glide for ages, some that don't glide at all, and they'll have all kinds of different characteristics in combat. There's like a vampire vehicle. There's so many different spins on it. So this is just a massive game where your impressions of the game and your takeaways from the game are going to differ, I think, wildly depending on how you mesh with any given vehicle's characteristics in the different modes, and indeed what you find yourself getting used to and what you find yourself enjoying. And yeah, there's so many races here, so many events, so many modes, so many cosmetics, so many challenges. There's a ton of stuff we didn't touch on. Online, a cosmetic store, a cosmetics customizer, where you can make all kinds of crazy things. Like it's just,
oh my God,
it's overwhelming. So and I actually totally understand why Sakurai needed like 2 hours of directs to kind of give you a sense of this game, because there's so much stuff in it.
How did he make this, man?
Most of the games, when we discussed them on Digital Foundry, I kind of explained like, oh, it's a third-person shooter, it's a racing game, it's an MMO, it's this, it's that. You kind of have a template for what it is. With this game, there really isn't anything else like it. So if you want to take a chance on a unique experience that's like nothing else you've ever probably played, except perhaps for the original Kirby Air Ride to some degree, I think this is a good game to take a gamble on. And I'm certainly not regretting buying it. I'm enjoying it quite a bit so far, but I think it will take a good amount more time before I feel comfortable saying, like, is this a good game or is this a great game?
Exactly.
That's kind of the space I'm in at the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think in both cases, the reason this is coming out later is that we actually just bought the game ourselves. So,
yeah.
And I actually bought the physical version, by the way, and we didn't mention it, but the loading times are ever so slightly slower on the cart, which is something to look at. But the more shocking thing I noticed is that the box art for this game, I don't know if you're ready for this, Oliver. Kirby is happy.
Oh, wow. He's
So
usually kind of angry, isn't he?
So usually the Japanese versions have happy Kirby, and then the Western version has angry Kirby. And I guess that kind of changed with Kirby in the Forgotten Land, where he had like a more neutral expression, but now he's visibly happy on the box art, which I feel
Yeah.
like we've entered into like a new universe here, that the angry eyebrows are gone. So
Absolutely.
for those that were waiting for angry Kirby on the box, I'm afraid he's not here. He might be gone forever. Who knows? But what is gone forever is this video. So if you made it all the way to the end of this thing, congratulations, you are a winner. And so are you, Oliver, because I appreciate all the work you did on this one.
Oh, thanks, John. It was a pleasure, as always, with your great expertise as well and your experience. But I had a lot of fun covering this game. I think it's a very interesting game. I think people are really going to click with it, or perhaps not click with it. But I think that kind of divisiveness is, in some cases, a sign of great art. And I think that's true with this game as well.
Indeed, indeed. And thank you to everyone who watched it up to this point, and we'll see you next time. Maybe in the city trials, I don't know.